Right after my son called saying he was coming, I got a text message. Leave now. Minutes later, my world collapsed. I never imagined my own family could orchestrate such cruelty. Today I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. I live in a cramped third-floor walk-up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where the smell of Chinese takeout mingles with the exhaust fumes that seep through my cracked windows. Every morning, I wake to the sound of construction hammers and car horns, a symphony of urban chaos that mirrors the turmoil in my heart. The apartment is small, barely 600 square feet of faded linoleum and peeling wallpaper. My bedroom doubles as a storage room for boxes of family memorabilia I can't bear to throw away. The kitchen is so narrow that I have to step aside when I open the refrigerator door. But it's mine. And for the longest time, it was the only place where I felt safe from the storm that had become my family relationships. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. I shuffled to the kitchen in my worn pink slippers, the ones my late husband George had bought me 15 years ago. They're falling apart now, the fabric thin as tissue paper, but I can't replace them. They're one of the few things left that holds his memory. I was stirring my instant coffee when the phone rang. The caller ID showed my eldest son's name, David. My heart skipped. David never called before noon, and certainly not on a weekday when he should be at his law firm in Midtown. His voice trembled when I answered. "Mom, I'm coming over. We need to talk." There was something desperate in his tone, something that made my stomach clench with worry. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked, but he'd already hung up. For a moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe, after months of cold shoulders and canceled dinners, my son was finally ready to bridge the gap that had grown between us. Maybe he missed me the way I missed him every single day. I rushed to tidy up the apartment, smoothing the threadbare couch cushions and hiding the stack of unpaid bills behind the toaster. I wanted everything to look perfect for David's visit. I wanted him to see that despite everything, I was still his mother, still trying to create a home worth visiting. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. 2 words that froze my blood. Leave now. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped the phone. Who would send such a message? And why? The timing seemed too coincidental, coming just minutes after David's urgent call. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was someone watching me? Did David know about this message? Was I in some kind of danger I didn't understand? I called David back immediately, my fingers fumbling with the numbers. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. The silence on the other end felt like a rejection, like a door slamming in my face. Standing in my tiny kitchen, clutching my phone, I felt smaller than I had in years. The morning sunlight streaming through my window couldn't warm the chill that had settled in my bones. I looked around my modest apartment, at the faded family photos on the refrigerator, at the half-finished crossword puzzle on the table, at the life I'd built from the scraps left after everyone else had taken what they needed. That anonymous text message wasn't just threatening, it was prophetic. Because in the hours that followed, I would discover that leaving wasn't just a suggestion. It was exactly what my family had been hoping I'd do all along. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story really began, to the years of sacrifice and silence that led to that terrible Tuesday morning. Because you need to understand how deeply I loved my family before you can comprehend how completely they betrayed me. George and I raised our 2 sons in this same neighborhood, though back then we had a proper 2-bedroom apartment on Orchard Street. David was the ambitious one, always talking about becoming a lawyer and making lots of money. Michael was quieter, more artistic, but just as determined to build something meaningful with his life. After George died 10 years ago, I sold our apartment and moved to this smaller place. The money from the sale went into a savings account I called my family fund, money set aside to help my boys whenever they needed it. And believe me, they needed it more often than I could afford to give. David's law school loans consumed $20,000 of that fund. When he couldn't make rent during his first year as an associate, I covered it for 6 months. When Michael's photography business struggled, I paid for his equipment, his studio deposit, his marketing materials. When David's wife Sarah had complications during her pregnancy, I paid for the private room at Mount Sinai, for the specialists, for the round-the-clock care she needed. I never asked for repayment. These weren't loans. They were gifts from a mother's heart. Every dollar I gave felt like an investment in their happiness, in their success, in the family legacy George and I had worked so hard to build. But somewhere along the way, my generosity stopped feeling like love and started feeling like obligation. My sons began treating my bank account like their personal safety net. Phone calls became requests for money. Visits became negotiations about how much I could contribute to their latest crisis. The shift was so gradual I almost missed it. David would call and chat about work, about the weather, about everything except what he really wanted. Then, just before hanging up, he'd mention a bill he couldn't quite cover, an opportunity that required a small investment, a temporary setback that my help could resolve. "I hate to ask, Mom," he'd say, and I'd believe him. "I'll pay you back as soon as the case settles." But the cases never seemed to settle in his favor, and my savings account grew smaller with each conversation. Michael was more direct but somehow more manipulative. He'd show up at my apartment with flowers and takeout from my favorite Chinese restaurant, spend an hour asking about my health and my neighbors, making me feel loved and valued. Then he'd pull out his phone to show me pictures of his latest photography project, explaining how close he was to a breakthrough, how much potential income awaited if only he could afford the right camera, the right lens, the right software. "You've always believed in my art, Mom," he'd say, and he was right. I did believe in him. I believed in both my sons with the fierce devotion that only a mother can understand. So I wrote the checks, transferred the funds, depleted my nest egg one emergency at a time. But love, real love, should never feel like a transaction. And by the time I realized what was happening, I'd already paid a price I couldn't calculate. Not just in dollars, but in dignity, in respect, in the fundamental relationship between parent and child. The first sign of trouble came during David's birthday dinner last spring. I'd made reservations at a nice Italian restaurant in Little Italy, the kind of place George and I used to go for anniversaries. I wore my best dress, a navy blue number I'd bought for David's law school graduation, and arrived early to make sure everything was perfect. David showed up 20 minutes late with Sarah and their 2 children, my grandchildren Emma and Jake. The kids barely looked up from their phones to acknowledge my presence. Sarah offered a perfunctory hello before immediately launching into a story about their recent vacation to the Hamptons, a vacation I'd helped fund, though she didn't mention that detail. Throughout dinner, I felt like an outsider at my own celebration. David and Sarah discussed their friends, their work, their plans for renovating their kitchen. When I tried to contribute to the conversation, to share news about my book club or my volunteer work at the church, they responded with polite nods before returning to topics that didn't include me. The breaking point came when the check arrived. David glanced at it, then looked at me expectantly. "You've got this, right, Mom?" he said, not really asking. "Things are tight right now with the kitchen renovation." I paid the bill, of course. But as I watched him pocket the receipt without so much as a thank you, something shifted inside me. This wasn't a son celebrating his birthday with his mother. This was a creditor collecting payment from a debtor. After dinner, as we stood outside the restaurant, I suggested we walk to the park nearby, maybe spend a little more time together. David checked his watch and shook his head. "We really need to get the kids home, school night and all." He gave me a quick hug, the kind you'd give a distant acquaintance, and walked away without looking back. I took the subway home alone, surrounded by strangers who somehow felt more familiar than my own family. In the darkness of the tunnel, I caught my reflection in the window and saw something that broke my heart. An old woman who had confused generosity with love, who had bought her way into relationships that should have been freely given. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and calculated how much money I'd given my sons over the years. The number was staggering. Nearly $100,000 from my savings, my husband's life insurance, my modest investment portfolio. Money that should have secured my retirement had instead funded their lifestyles while my own needs went unmet. My refrigerator was nearly empty because I'd chosen their mortgages over my groceries. My clothes were threadbare because I'd chosen their emergencies over my wardrobe. My social life had withered because every dollar I had went to maintaining relationships with people who only called when they needed something. The loneliness was crushing. George had been dead for a decade, but I felt his absence most acutely in moments like these, when I needed someone to remind me of my worth, someone to hold me while I grieved the family I thought I had. I pulled out the old photo albums, the ones I kept in a box under my bed, page after page of memories, David's first day of school, Michael's high school graduation, family vacations to the Catskills, Christmas mornings filled with laughter and love. In every picture, I saw the same thing: a mother who had given everything, and children who had grown up expecting nothing less. But when had they stopped being grateful? When had my love become an entitlement rather than a gift? And more importantly, when had I allowed it to happen? The questions haunted me through the sleepless hours that followed. By dawn, I had made a decision that terrified me as much as it empowered me. I was going to stop being their personal bank. I was going to learn the difference between helping and enabling, between love and transaction. I had no idea how much that decision would cost me. The changes started small. When David called the following week asking for help with Emma's private school tuition, I said something I'd never said before. I need to think about it. The silence on the other end was deafening. What do you mean, think about it? He asked, his voice tight with irritation. Emma's education is important, Mom. This isn't optional. Neither is my retirement security, I replied, surprised by my own boldness. I'll call you back tomorrow. I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding like I'd just committed a crime. In a way, maybe I had. I'd violated the unspoken agreement that had governed our relationship for years. They needed, I provided, no questions asked. When I called back the next day, I offered to pay half the tuition instead of the full amount. David's response was swift and cutting. If you can't afford it, just say so, Mom. We'll figure something else out. The disappointment in his voice was unmistakable, but underneath it was something worse. Irritation that his usual solution had suddenly become complicated. Michael's reaction was even more revealing. When I told him I couldn't lend him money for new photography equipment, he accused me of not believing in his talent anymore. I guess now that Dad's gone, you don't care about supporting your family, he said, wielding guilt like a weapon. Your father supported dreams, I replied quietly. He never funded delusions. The words came out harsher than I intended, but they carried a truth I'd been afraid to acknowledge. Michael had been about to break through in his photography career for over 5 years. How many cameras, how many workshops, how many business ventures would it take before he admitted that maybe his dreams needed to be tempered with reality? The conversation ended with Michael hanging up on me, and I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. When he finally called, it wasn't to apologize or to check on my well-being. It was to tell me he'd found another investor, as if my refusal to fund his latest project was a betrayal rather than a boundary. The isolation that followed was brutal. Phone calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Invitations to family gatherings arrived later and later, if at all. When I did see my sons, they were polite but distant, as if I were a relative they were obligated to tolerate, rather than a mother they chose to love. The worst part wasn't the obvious rejection. It was the subtle ways they began to erase me from their lives. David stopped asking about my health. Michael stopped sharing his work with me. My grandchildren, who had once hugged me enthusiastically, now offered awkward waves before disappearing into their rooms. I began to understand that my value to them had always been financial. Without my willingness to solve their problems with money, I had nothing left to offer that they wanted. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. For the first time in years, I could see my relationships clearly, without the fog of obligation and guilt that had obscured the truth. That clarity came at a price. My days stretched long and empty, filled with silence where there had once been conversation. I found myself talking to George's picture, asking him what he would think of our sons, whether he would be proud of the men they'd become or disappointed in the mother I'd been. The holidays that year were particularly painful. I spent Thanksgiving alone, eating up a Stuffers turkey dinner while my sons celebrated with their in-laws. Christmas was worse. I bought presents for my grandchildren and never got the chance to deliver them because David forgot to confirm our plans, and Michael was too busy with a last-minute photography gig. I placed those unwrapped presents under my small artificial Christmas tree, a monument to relationships that existed only in my memory. On Christmas morning, I opened them myself, imagining the joy they might have brought to children who had apparently been taught that Grandma's love wasn't worth their time. The new year brought no resolution, only a deepening sense of isolation. My neighbors began to notice my declining spirits. Mrs. Chen from across the hall started leaving small containers of soup outside my door. The building superintendent, Mr. Rodriguez, made a point of asking how I was doing whenever we passed in the lobby. Their kindness highlighted the cruelty of my situation. Strangers showed me more consideration than my own children. People who owed me nothing offered more warmth than people who owed me everything. In February, I made an appointment with a financial advisor, partly to understand my situation and partly to have someone to talk to who wouldn't judge me for the choices I'd made. Janet Morrison was a woman about my age who had built her practice helping seniors navigate the complex intersection of family and money. "You're not the first parent who's been here," she told me after reviewing my financial history. "Adult children who see their parents as ATMs rather than people, it's more common than you'd think." She showed me charts and graphs that quantified what I already knew. I'd given away my financial security in exchange for relationships that weren't real. At my current spending rate, with no more contributions from me to my sons, I had enough money to live modestly for another 15 years. With continued helping, I'd be broke within 5. "The question," Janet said gently, "is whether you're ready to choose your future over their convenience." I walked home from that appointment in a daze, seeing my neighborhood with new eyes. The Lower East Side had always been a place where immigrants and working-class families struggled to build better lives for their children. But what happened when those children took their parents' sacrifices for granted? What happened when success bred entitlement instead of gratitude? That evening, I called both my sons and asked them to meet me for lunch the following Saturday. I had something important to discuss, I told them. Something that couldn't wait any longer. David seemed annoyed by the interruption to his weekend plans. Michael acted suspicious, as if he thought I was luring him into some kind of trap. But they both agreed to meet me at a diner in Chinatown, neutral territory where we could speak honestly without the distractions of their homes or mine. I arrived early and chose a corner booth where we could have privacy. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, but when I saw them walking toward me, my sons, the babies I'd nursed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, my carefully planned speech evaporated. They sat across from me looking impatient and vaguely resentful, as if this lunch was an inconvenience they were enduring, rather than time with their mother they were choosing to share. David checked his phone before I'd even ordered my coffee. Michael drummed his fingers on the table and avoided eye contact. "I want to talk about our relationship," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "About what's happened between us over the past few years." "Nothing's happened, Mom," David interrupted. "We're fine. We're family. Are we?" I asked quietly. "When's the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When's the last time you invited me to dinner without needing something from me first?" The question hung in the air between us. Michael shifted uncomfortably. David's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic," Sarah chimed in. I hadn't even noticed she'd joined us. "We're all busy people. That doesn't mean we don't care." "Caring isn't the same as loving," I replied. "And loving isn't the same as using." That's when the real conversation began, the one I'd been avoiding for months. I told them how their phone calls had started to feel like invoices. I explained how their distance after my refusal to fund their requests had hurt me more than any argument could have. I described the loneliness of holidays spent alone while they celebrated with people who hadn't sacrificed years of their own security for their benefit. David's response was swift and defensive. "We never asked you to give us money, Mom. You offered. You wanted to help." "I wanted to love you," I corrected. "I thought helping was the same thing. So now you're saying we don't love you?" Michael's voice was rising, drawing glances from other diners. "Because we're not sufficiently grateful for your generosity?" "I'm saying, I don't know what love looks like anymore," I admitted. "I know what transactions look like. I know what obligations look like. But love? Real love? I'm not sure either of us remembers." The conversation deteriorated from there. Sarah accused me of emotional manipulation. David suggested I was having senior moments that made me paranoid about their motives. Michael walked out before we'd even ordered food, claiming he didn't need to listen to my guilt trip. I sat in that diner booth alone, watching my sons retreat from a conversation that should have brought us closer together. The waitress, a young woman who looked to be about Emma's age, approached tentatively. "You okay, honey?" she asked with genuine concern. I nodded, though we both knew it was a lie. I paid for 3 untouched cups of coffee and walked home through streets that suddenly felt foreign, as if I'd been exiled from a country I'd helped to build. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I blocked both my sons' phone numbers. Not because I didn't want to hear from them, but because I needed to know if they would call when they couldn't ask for money. I needed to understand whether our relationship could exist without financial transactions at its center. The silence that followed was absolute. Days turned into weeks with no contact, no checking in, no concern about why their mother had suddenly become unreachable. The message was clear. Without my willingness to fund their lives, I had nothing of value to offer them. But life has a way of testing your resolve when you're at your weakest point, and mine was about to face the ultimate challenge. Spring arrived with unusual warmth that year, and I found myself spending more time sitting on the fire escape outside my apartment, watching the neighborhood come alive with activity. Children played on the sidewalks while their mothers chatted in doorways. Elderly men gathered around card tables in the community garden, speaking in languages I didn't understand but with expressions I recognized. Contentment, companionship, connection. I envied their ease with each other, their ability to find joy in simple gatherings. My own life felt increasingly hollow, defined more by absence than presence. The money I was no longer giving to my sons sat untouched in my bank account, a bitter reminder of how financial security without emotional connection was its own form of poverty. In early May, I received an unexpected phone call from Emma, my granddaughter. She was 15 now, old enough to have her own opinions about family dynamics, and she wanted to know why I hadn't been to any of her school events lately. "Daddy says you're being difficult," she told me with the brutal honesty that only teenagers possess. "But I think he's being mean to you." Her words cracked something open in my chest that I'd been trying to keep sealed. Here was someone who saw the situation clearly, without the complications of financial entanglement or wounded pride. Emma still remembered the grandmother who had shown up to every recital, every game, every celebration. Not because I was obligated to, but because I wanted to be there. "Would you like to have lunch with me sometime?" I asked her, hardly daring to hope. "Yes," she said immediately. "Just us. No parents." We met the following Saturday at a small cafe near her school in Brooklyn. Emma had grown taller since I'd last seen her, her face more angular and adult-like, but her smile was still the same one that had melted my heart when she was little. Over sandwiches and milkshakes, she told me about her classes, her friends, her dreams of studying journalism in college. I listened with the kind of attention I used to give her when she was small, when every word she spoke felt like a precious gift. "Why don't you come to dinner anymore?" she asked eventually, her directness catching me off guard. I struggled to find an age-appropriate way to explain the complexities of adult relationships, but Emma was too smart for euphemisms. "Dad and Uncle Michael only call you when they need money," she said matter-of-factly. "I've heard them talking. They think you're their personal bank." The observation stung because it came from someone who loved all of us, someone who could see the situation without the filters of hurt or justification that clouded my own perspective. "I love your father and your uncle," I told her carefully, "but I'm trying to figure out how to love them without losing myself." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mom says you're being selfish, but I think you're being smart. My friend Jessica's grandmother gives her family everything, and now she has to live with them because she can't afford her own apartment. She's miserable." The wisdom in her words humbled me. This 15-year-old girl understood concepts that grown men with law degrees and business aspirations had somehow missed. Love shouldn't impoverish the lover. Generosity shouldn't become exploitation. Family relationships should lift everyone up, not drain some members to benefit others. After lunch, as I hugged Emma goodbye, she whispered in my ear, "I miss you, Grandma. I wish things could go back to how they used to be." "Maybe they can," I whispered back, though I wasn't sure what that would look like. The encounter with Emma gave me energy I hadn't felt in months. That evening, I unblocked my son's phone numbers, not because I was ready to return to our old patterns, but because I was finally ready to establish new ones. I wanted to see if they missed me the way Emma did, or if they'd simply found other sources for what they'd been taking from me. It didn't take long to get my answer. David called 3 days later, his voice tight with frustration. "Mom, what's going on? I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Have you?" I asked mildly. "About what?" "Emma said you had lunch with her, without checking with us first. That's not appropriate. Since when do I need permission to see my granddaughter?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't apologize for it. "Since you started acting erratically," he replied. "Sarah and I are concerned about your judgment lately." There it was. The subtle accusation that my setting boundaries was actually evidence of cognitive decline. It was a manipulation tactic I'd seen deployed against other elderly people, the suggestion that their desire for autonomy was really a symptom of deteriorating mental capacity. "My judgment is fine," I said calmly. "What's erratic is expecting to receive financial support from someone while simultaneously questioning their competence." The silence that followed was loaded with implication. David was calculating, trying to figure out how to get what he needed without acknowledging what I was saying. "We can talk about this later," he said finally. "Right now, I need to ask you about something urgent. Emma's school is raising tuition, and we're going to need help covering the increase." And there it was. Not, "How are you feeling, Mom?" Not, "I'm sorry we haven't talked in weeks." Just another request for money delivered as if our previous conversation had never happened. "No," I said simply. "No what?" "No, I won't help with the tuition increase. You'll need to find another solution." The explosion that followed was swift and vicious. David accused me of abandoning my family in their time of need. He suggested that my refusal to help with Emma's education was evidence that I didn't care about her future. He implied that George would be ashamed of my selfishness. Each accusation was designed to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my own financial security over their convenience. But instead of the usual stab of remorse, I felt something unexpected. Relief. I was finally seeing the relationship clearly, without the complications of hope or denial. "David," I interrupted his tirade, "when's my birthday?" The question stopped him mid-sentence. "What does that have to do with anything? Just answer the question. When is your mother's birthday?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. My son, who could recite complex legal precedents from memory, who remembered every important date in his professional calendar, couldn't recall the date his mother was born. "I don't see how that's relevant," he said defensively. It's relevant because it shows me where I rank in your priorities. You remember Emma's tuition deadlines, but not my birthday. You know when your mortgage payment is due, but not when I might need support or companionship or just a phone call to see how I'm doing. You're being ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm being honest, I replied, and honesty is apparently something our family needs to practice more. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking not with fear but with adrenaline. For the first time in years, I'd spoken my truth without apologizing for it, without softening it to make someone else more comfortable. The confrontation with David marked a turning point, but it wasn't the end of my trials. In fact, it was barely the beginning. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a document that made my blood run cold. A formal notice that I was being removed as beneficiary from a family trust George and I had established years earlier. The trust contained assets worth nearly $50,000, money we'd saved specifically for emergencies or for my care as I aged. It had been established with both sons as co-trustees and me as the primary beneficiary. Now, according to the legal paperwork, they had voted to change the terms, making themselves the beneficiaries instead. I read the document 3 times, trying to understand the legal language, but the basic message was clear. My sons had effectively stolen my inheritance from me while I was still alive to see it happen. The betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity. They hadn't just stopped calling me or reduced their visits. They had actively worked to strip me of resources George and I had intended for my security. The timing was particularly cruel, coming so soon after my refusal to fund their latest requests. This was their retaliation, their way of punishing me for setting boundaries. I called the law firm immediately, demanding to speak with someone who could explain how such a thing was possible. The lawyer who took my call was brisk and professional. Mrs. Patterson, according to our records, you were notified of the trustee's intention to modify the trust terms 60 days ago. Since no objection was filed within the required timeframe, the changes have been implemented. I was never notified, I protested. I never received any paperwork. The notification was sent to the address on file, he replied. Perhaps you should check with your postal service if there was a delivery issue. I knew there hadn't been a delivery issue. David and Michael had simply provided the wrong address or arranged for the notification to be sent somewhere I wouldn't see it. They had manipulated the system to steal from me legally, technically adhering to requirements while ensuring I couldn't defend myself. The lawyer explained that I could contest the changes, but it would require hiring my own attorney and potentially months of expensive litigation with no guarantee of success. Given that David was himself a lawyer with connections throughout the legal community, my chances of winning would be minimal. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the legal documents that had just impoverished me by $50,000. This wasn't just financial theft. It was emotional assassination. My sons had declared war on me, and they'd used their knowledge of my trusting nature as a weapon against me. That night, I hardly slept. I kept thinking about George, about the conversations we'd had when we established that trust. We'd wanted to ensure that I would be cared for if anything happened to him, never imagining that the people we were trusting to protect me would be the ones who ultimately betrayed me the most. By morning, I had made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to fight back, not just for the money, but for my dignity. I was going to stop being a victim and start being a force. I called a lawyer I'd found online, a woman who specialized in elder abuse cases. Her name was Patricia Valdez, and her office was in a converted brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. When I told her my story over the phone, she asked me to come in immediately. Patricia was younger than my sons, probably in her early 40s, with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of family cruelty. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes and asking pointed questions about dates, amounts, and documentation. "This is elder financial abuse," she told me bluntly when I'd finished. "What your sons have done is not just morally wrong, it's illegal. The question is whether you're prepared for the fight that would be required to address it." She explained that pursuing legal action against David and Michael would likely destroy what remained of our family relationships permanently. There would be depositions, court appearances, publicity. The process would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. But, she added, sometimes the fight is worth it. Not just for the money you might recover, but for the message you send about your own worth. I left Patricia's office with a retainer agreement and a court date, feeling more empowered than I had in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was taking action instead of simply reacting to what others did to me. The legal battle that followed was every bit as difficult as Patricia had warned. David hired his own attorney, a smooth-talking man who tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman who didn't understand the documents she'd signed. Michael claimed he'd been merely following David's legal advice, positioning himself as an unwitting participant in decisions he didn't fully comprehend. But Patricia was relentless. She subpoenaed bank records showing the pattern of financial requests from my sons. She documented the timeline of my setting boundaries and their retaliation through the trust modification. She even deposed Emma, who testified that she'd overheard her father and uncle discussing how to manage mom's money more effectively. The case never went to trial. 3 days before the scheduled court date, David's attorney called Patricia with a settlement offer. They would restore me as beneficiary of the original trust amount, minus legal fees, in exchange for my agreement not to pursue additional damages or file a complaint with the State Bar Association. It was less than complete victory, but it was vindication. I had fought back and won, proving to myself and to them that I wouldn't be victimized without consequence. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was psychological. I had rediscovered my own strength, my ability to stand up for myself, even when it meant standing alone. The settlement check arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, along with a brief note from David's attorney confirming that all legal obligations had been fulfilled. There was no personal message from either of my sons, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology for the pain they'd caused me. That afternoon, I took the subway to Central Park and found a bench near the reservoir where George and I used to walk on Sunday mornings. The sky was clear, the kind of perfect blue that made the city feel manageable and beautiful despite its chaos. I thought about the woman I'd been a year earlier, desperate for connection, willing to buy love, afraid to ask for respect. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered fondly but could never be again. The fight with my sons had cost me more than money. It had cost me the fantasy of the family I thought I had, the illusion that blood relationships were automatically loving relationships. But it had also given me something invaluable, the knowledge that I could survive without them, that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval or affection. As I sat on that bench, watching runners circle the reservoir and families play in the grass, I realized that my story wasn't ending. It was beginning. For the first time in decades, I was free to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by what I could give to other people. That freedom would soon be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. September brought an unexpected phone call from Sarah, David's wife. Her voice was strained when she reached out, carrying a tension I'd never heard before. "Margaret, I know things have been difficult between you and the family, but I think we need to talk. There's something you need to know about David." My first instinct was suspicion. After everything that had happened, any communication from that branch of the family felt potentially manipulative. But something in Sarah's tone suggested genuine distress rather than calculated performance. We met at a coffee shop in Soho, far enough from both our neighborhoods to feel neutral. Sarah looked older than when I'd last seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that kept her hands constantly moving, fidgeting with her purse, stirring her latte, checking her phone. "David's in trouble," she said without preamble. "Financial trouble. Serious trouble." She explained that David had been making risky investments with client money from his law firm, hoping to generate quick returns that would resolve his mounting personal debts. The investments had failed catastrophically, leaving him facing both bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for misappropriating client funds. "He's going to lose his license," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe go to prison. We're going to lose everything: the house, the kids' college funds, our savings." I listened without interrupting, processing this information alongside everything I knew about my son's character and choices. Part of me felt vindicated. His financial desperation explained the increased pressure on me for money, the theft from the family trust, the escalating hostility when I'd refused his requests. But another part of me felt the familiar tug of maternal concern. This was still my son, still the little boy I'd rocked to sleep and worried over through childhood illnesses and teenage heartbreaks. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. Sarah's composure cracked then, and tears started flowing down her cheeks. "Because Emma asked me to. She said you were the only one who might be able to help, and that you were the only one who had ever really cared about our family without expecting anything back." The irony was staggering. After months of being portrayed as selfish and unreasonable for setting financial boundaries, I was now being asked to rescue the very people who had stolen from me, lied to me, and emotionally abused me. "What kind of help are you asking for?" I said carefully. "Money," Sarah admitted. "We need about $30,000 to repay some of the client funds and avoid criminal charges. David's too proud to ask you himself, but I thought maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the request hung between us like a heavy curtain. They wanted me to save David from the consequences of his own choices, to once again sacrifice my security for their convenience. The old me would have already been calculating how to liquidate investments or borrow against my apartment. The new me felt something different. Clarity. "No," I said simply. Sarah's face crumpled. "Please, Margaret. This is different. This is David's future we're talking about. Emma's future. This is exactly the same, I replied. David made choices that put his family at risk, just like he made choices that put me at risk when he stole from my trust fund. The only difference is the scale of the consequences. He's your son, Sarah pleaded as if that fact alone should override all other considerations. Yes, he is. And because he's my son, I love him enough not to enable him anymore. Saving him from bankruptcy won't teach him to make better decisions. It will just teach him that someone else will always clean up his messes. The conversation ended with Sarah accusing me of heartlessness, and me walking away feeling both sad and strong. I was sad that my son's life had come to this point, but strong in my conviction that helping him avoid consequences wasn't the same as helping him grow. Over the following weeks, the family pressure intensified. Michael called for the first time in months, not to check on my well-being, but to berate me for abandoning David in his time of need. Even Emma called, crying and asking why I wouldn't help her father when I had the money sitting in the bank. Each conversation was designed to make me feel guilty, to convince me that setting boundaries made me a bad mother, a selfish person, an unworthy member of the family. But I held firm, not because I didn't love them, but because I finally understood that real love sometimes meant saying no, when yes would be harmful to everyone involved. David's legal troubles played out exactly as Sarah had predicted. He lost his law license, faced criminal charges that resulted in 2 years of probation and community service, and had to declare personal bankruptcy. The family lost their expensive Brooklyn Heights apartment and moved in with Sarah's parents in Queens. Through all of this, I felt sadness, but not guilt. I mourned the choices my son had made, the opportunities he'd wasted, the pain his family was experiencing, but I didn't feel responsible for fixing problems I hadn't created or preventing consequences he had earned through his own actions. The silence from my sons became complete after David's conviction. No phone calls, no holiday cards, no acknowledgement of my existence in their reconstructed lives. Michael found steady work as a wedding photographer, a more reliable income than his artistic pursuits had provided. David eventually got a job managing a small legal clinic in Queens, using his experience to help low-income clients navigate the system that had once worked for him. I learned these details not from them, but from Emma, who maintained contact despite her parents' disapproval. She would call occasionally to update me on family news and to ask for stories about her grandfather George, memories of a time when our family had been defined by love rather than transaction. "Do you miss them?" she asked me one afternoon during one of our phone conversations. "I miss the people I thought they were," I told her honestly. "I miss the sons I raised, the men I hoped they would become, but I don't miss being a bank account with maternal feelings." Emma laughed at that, a sound that reminded me of her grandfather's laugh, rich and genuine and free of calculation. "I understand now why you did what you did," she said. "It wasn't mean, it was brave." Those words meant more to me than any apology I might have received from her parents. They told me that at least one member of the younger generation had learned something valuable from watching our family dynamics play out, that the painful lessons of the past year hadn't been entirely wasted. As autumn turned to winter, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life. My days were quieter than they'd been in years, but they were also more genuinely mine. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking watercolor classes at the community center, and developed friendships with women who valued my company rather than my checkbook. The loneliness I'd feared when I first started setting boundaries had been replaced by something I hadn't experienced in decades: contentment. I was living within my means, spending time with people who appreciated me, and making choices based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. My apartment, which had always felt cramped and temporary, began to feel like home. I bought new curtains, painted the kitchen a warm yellow, and filled the windowsills with plants that thrived in the eastern light. The space reflected my personality now instead of just housing my obligations. I even started dating, something that surprised me as much as it surprised Emma when I mentioned it during one of our calls. Harold was a widower I'd met in my watercolor class, a retired accountant who shared my love of old movies and Chinese takeout. Our relationship was comfortable rather than passionate, companionship rather than romance, but it was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, qualities that had been missing from my life for far too long. "Grandma has a boyfriend," Emma announced during a family dinner, according to the reports she shared with me later. The news had apparently caused quite a stir, with David expressing concern about my judgment and Michael worried that I was being taken advantage of by some elderly gold digger. The irony of their concern wasn't lost on me. Men who had systematically exploited my generosity were now worried that someone else might do the same thing. Their objections had nothing to do with my happiness and everything to do with their discomfort at seeing me build a life that didn't revolve around their needs. As winter deepened, I realized I was approaching the anniversary of David's first urgent phone call, the conversation that had started this whole transformation. A full year had passed since that Tuesday morning when an anonymous text message had shattered my hope and set me on a path I never could have anticipated. I thought about that woman often, the version of myself who had cleaned her apartment hoping to impress a son who was planning to manipulate her, who had clung to the fantasy of family reconciliation while being systematically betrayed by the people she loved most. That woman felt like a character from someone else's story now, someone I remembered with sympathy but couldn't relate to anymore. The changes in my life weren't just external. New routines, new relationships, new ways of spending time. They were fundamental alterations to my understanding of who I was and what I deserved. The phone call that would test this new understanding came on a snowy Thursday in February, almost exactly 11 months after David's legal troubles had begun. This time it was Michael calling, his voice subdued in a way I'd never heard before. "Mom, I know we haven't talked in a while, but something's happened. Something bad." My first thought was that David had violated his probation somehow, or that Sarah had been in an accident, or that Emma had gotten into some kind of trouble. Family crises had conditioned me to expect the worst when phone calls came out of the blue. "Sarah has cancer," Michael continued before I could ask questions. "Breast cancer. She's going to need surgery, chemotherapy, the whole thing. David doesn't have insurance through his new job yet, and they're looking at medical bills that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars." He paused, letting that information settle, and I could hear the calculation in the silence that followed. This was the setup, the emotional context designed to make his next request seem reasonable, even urgent. "We were hoping you might be able to help," he said finally. "I know things have been complicated between us, but this is life or death. This is Sarah's life we're talking about." And there it was. Not an apology for the past year of silence. Not an acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused me or the money they'd stolen. Just another request for financial assistance, wrapped in medical urgency, and delivered as if I were obligated to provide it. The old me would have been reaching for my checkbook before he'd finished talking. Cancer was serious. Sarah was still my daughter-in-law, and Emma needed her mother healthy and present. These were all true facts, legitimate concerns that deserved attention and support. But the new me heard something else in Michael's request. The assumption that my money was available for their emergencies regardless of how they'd treated me. That blood relationship trumped personal boundaries. That my role in the family was to solve problems rather than to be valued as a person. "I'm sorry to hear about Sarah's diagnosis," I said carefully. "Cancer is frightening for everyone involved." "So you'll help?" Michael asked quickly, interpreting my sympathy as agreement. I didn't say that. I said I was sorry to hear the news. Those are two different things. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. I could almost hear Michael recalibrating, trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation when his usual approaches weren't working. "Mom, this is serious. Sarah could die if she doesn't get treatment." "Sarah could die if she does get treatment," I replied. "Cancer is unpredictable, and throwing money at it doesn't guarantee survival. What I can guarantee is that giving you hundreds of thousands of dollars would guarantee my own financial death. You can't put money ahead of family," Michael said, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm not putting money ahead of family," I corrected. "I'm putting self-preservation ahead of emotional manipulation. If you want my support during this difficult time, I'm happy to provide it. But my support doesn't come with a checkbook attached." The conversation devolved from there into familiar patterns of guilt, accusation, and emotional blackmail. Michael accused me of being heartless. He suggested that George would be ashamed of my priorities. He implied that my refusal to help with Sarah's medical bills made me complicit in whatever happened to her. But something had changed in me over the past year. The words that once would have sent me spiraling into guilt and self-doubt now felt like arrows bouncing off armor I hadn't known I was wearing. "Michael," I interrupted his tirade, "I love Sarah. I love Emma. I even love you and David, despite everything that's happened between us. But love doesn't mean bankruptcy. Care doesn't mean self-destruction. And family doesn't mean that some members exist only to fund the crises of others." "So that's it?" he asked bitterly. "You're just going to let Sarah die?" "I'm going to let Sarah live or die based on her medical care, her doctor's expertise, and factors that have nothing to do with my bank account. What I'm not going to do is pretend that money can buy outcomes when what you really want is for someone else to carry the burden of your fears." I hung up before he could respond, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been during any of our previous confrontations. The conversation had been painful, but it hadn't shaken my resolve or made me question my decisions. Over the following days, I did something that surprised even me. I researched Sarah's condition, learned about treatment options and survival rates, and found ways to support her that didn't involve writing checks I couldn't afford. I called Sarah directly, bypassing David and Michael entirely, and offered to drive her to chemotherapy appointments, to help with childcare while she recovered from surgery, to provide the kind of practical support that money couldn't buy. Sarah was initially suspicious, wondering what strings were attached to my offers. When I assured her there were none, that I simply wanted to help in ways that felt sustainable for me, she broke down crying. "I didn't know if you still cared about us after everything that happened," she admitted. "Caring and funding aren't the same thing," I told her. "I never stopped caring. I just stopped paying." That conversation marked the beginning of a different kind of relationship, not just with Sarah, but ultimately with the entire family. It took months of small gestures and consistent boundaries before trust started to rebuild, but it was trust based on respect rather than transaction. I drove Sarah to 6 chemotherapy sessions, sitting in hospital waiting rooms and holding her hand when the nausea became overwhelming. I picked Emma up from school on days when both her parents were dealing with medical appointments. I made soups and casseroles that could be frozen and reheated when no one felt like cooking. None of these gestures cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they cost me something more valuable: time and emotional energy given freely rather than extracted through manipulation. David and Michael watched these interactions warily, unsure how to respond to support that came without strings attached. They'd grown so accustomed to viewing me as a resource that my transformation into a person with boundaries and autonomous choices left them struggling to understand their own roles in the relationship. The breakthrough came during one of Sarah's chemotherapy sessions when David showed up unexpectedly at the hospital. I was sitting beside Sarah's chair, reading aloud from a novel she'd chosen, when he walked into the treatment room looking haggard and uncertain. "Mom," he said quietly, and something in his voice was different from any conversation we'd had in years. "Hello, David," I replied, not looking up from the book. He stood there for several minutes, watching me read to his wife, seeing a kind of care that couldn't be purchased or demanded. When I finished the chapter and looked up at him, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a child: vulnerability. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being here, for helping her." It wasn't an apology for everything that had happened between us, but it was acknowledgement of value I provided that had nothing to do with money. It was a start. Sarah's treatment was successful. The surgery removed all visible cancer, and the chemotherapy eliminated any remaining cells that couldn't be detected. Her recovery was slow but complete, aided by medical expertise, modern pharmaceuticals, and a support network that included me but wasn't dependent on my financial contribution. The experience taught all of us something important about the difference between helping and enabling, between support and dependency. I had been able to provide genuine assistance without compromising my own well-being or enabling someone else's irresponsible choices. As Sarah regained her strength and the crisis passed, the family dynamics gradually shifted towards something healthier. David and Michael didn't suddenly become perfect sons, but they did begin treating me more like a person and less like an arbitrary source of funding. Phone calls started including questions about my life, my friends, my activities. Invitations to family gatherings were extended without accompanying requests for financial contributions. Emma's visits became more frequent and more genuine, based on her desire to spend time with me rather than her parents' need for childcare assistance. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was organic, growing out of months of consistent boundaries maintained with compassion rather than anger. I had learned to say no to things that harmed me without saying no to people I loved, a distinction that had eluded me for decades. By the time spring returned to New York, marking 2 full years since David's first urgent phone call, our family had found a new equilibrium. Not the original closeness we'd once shared, which had been corrupted by financial dependency, but something different and potentially more sustainable: relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided transaction. I celebrated my 74th birthday that year with a party I hosted myself, attended by the watercolor class friends, Harold, Mrs. Chen from across the hall, and, surprisingly, all 3 generations of my biological family. Emma gave me a framed photo of the 2 of us from one of our lunch dates. Sarah brought flowers from her garden, now thriving again after her recovery. Michael presented a small photo album of pictures he'd taken during our recent family gatherings, a professional documentation of our rebuilt connections. David's gift was the most meaningful: a handwritten letter of apology that acknowledged the specific ways he had hurt me, taken responsibility for choices that had damaged our relationship, and expressed genuine gratitude for my forgiveness and continued presence in his life. The letter didn't erase the pain of the previous years, but it represented something I had thought was impossible: genuine accountability from someone who had wronged me, offered freely rather than extracted through punishment or ultimatum. As I read that letter aloud to Harold later that evening, I realized that my story had reached a resolution I never could have imagined when it began. I hadn't gotten everything I'd originally wanted, the uncomplicated love and easy closeness I'd once shared with my sons, but I had gotten something better. Relationships based on honesty, respect, and genuine choice. The woman who had cleaned her apartment 2 years ago, hoping to impress a son who was planning to manipulate her, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and ultimately happier. Someone who understood that love couldn't be purchased, demanded, or taken for granted, but had to be nurtured through mutual respect and genuine care. Standing on my fire escape that evening, looking out over the Lower East Side as the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Not the peace of resignation or defeat, but the peace of hard-won wisdom and authentic connection. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment I was transported back to that terrible morning when an anonymous threat had shattered my hope. But this message was from Emma, asking if I'd like to go to a museum with her the following weekend. "Just us two," she wrote. "No parents, no agenda. Just because I love you." I texted back immediately. "Yes, I'd love to." As I write this story, 6 months have passed since that birthday celebration. The family relationships continue to evolve, sometimes smoothly and sometimes with friction, but always with the understanding that each of us is a complete person deserving of respect. David has been promoted at the legal clinic and is working toward eventually having his law license restored. Michael's photography business is thriving, and he recently got engaged to a woman who seems to genuinely appreciate his artistic talents. Sarah is cancer-free and has returned to her job as a high school guidance counselor. Emma is applying to colleges and has asked me to help her with her essays, not financially, but by sharing stories about resilience, about standing up for yourself, about the difference between helping others and losing yourself in the process. I still live in the same small apartment on the Lower East Side, but it feels larger somehow, filled with friendships and activities and possibilities I couldn't see when it was merely a headquarters for financing other people's lives. Harold and I are planning a trip to Italy in the fall, something I never would have considered when every spare dollar was already committed to someone else's emergency or opportunity. We'll visit museums and eat wonderful food and create memories that belong to us, rather than to obligations we inherited or guilt we couldn't escape. The money I saved by setting boundaries has grown into a genuine emergency fund, not for my children's crises, but for my own future needs. I sleep better at night knowing that my security doesn't depend on someone else's goodwill or gratitude. But the most important change isn't financial or even relational. It's internal. I know who I am now in a way I didn't before this journey began. I'm not just someone's mother or someone's source of support. I'm Margaret Patterson, a woman with her own interests, her own friendships, her own dreams. I'm someone worth knowing for reasons that have nothing to do with what I can provide to others. The realization fills me with gratitude rather than anger, hope rather than regret. The years I spent as a transaction disguised as a relationship weren't wasted. They were preparation for something better. The pain I endured while learning to set boundaries wasn't punishment. It was the price of freedom. Today I want to leave you with the most important lesson I learned during those difficult years. Your worth is not determined by your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others. Love is not a purchase you make with your comfort, your security, or your self-respect. Family relationships, like all relationships, must be built on mutual care and genuine choice rather than obligation and guilt. If you recognize yourself in this story, if you've been funding relationships that drain you without nourishing you back, please know that change is possible. It's never too late to reclaim your life, to establish boundaries, to choose dignity over convenience and respect over transaction. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries. The people who don't respect your boundaries don't truly love you. They love what you do for them, which is not the same thing. Have you lived through something similar to my story? Have you known someone who struggled with these same choices between family obligation and self-preservation? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who needs to hear this message, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It helps me reach other people who might be struggling with these same difficult decisions. Sometimes we all need to know that we're not alone, that our pain is valid, and that change is possible no matter how impossible it might seem. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember, you are worth more than what you can give to others. You deserve love that doesn't come with a price tag attached. You have the right to choose respect over transaction every single day of your life.